The 1950s, it brought us shopping malls in suburbs, bomb shelters and rock music, names like Saint Laurent and Diefenbaker, and of course, TV and TV dinners. Starting Sunday, March 13th, CPAC presents a 9-part look at a decade that changed Canada. I'm Andrew Thomson from CPAC.ca, and today Holly Doan, the producer and host of the 50s, is joining us to talk more about the project. Holly, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
You know, we can look at the 30s, the 60s, and even the 70s as other pivotal decades in our history, but what drew you specifically to the 1950s?
Well, two things happened in the 1950s that had never happened before and have never happened since. Number one, Canada stepped onto the world stage. We had always lived in the context of the British Empire, and in the 50s we stepped forward with self-confidence, with very little self-doubt as a new and modern nation. Number two, in that decade, Canada became almost unrecognizable. And why do I say that? Well, in 1950, at the start of the decade, most Canadians did not live in cities. Most Canadians did not own their own home. They lived in apartments or they lived with the in-laws. Most Canadians had never been to college or university. Most Canadians had never received a government check of any kind, no pensions, no hospital insurance, and most Canadians did not own a car. They didn't even own a washing machine. Lots of people still didn't have electricity. So imagine if you had put yourself in a time machine to Canada in 1960, you might recognize ourselves. In 1950, absolutely not. Everything was transformed. Everything was different. And that's why it was a pivotal decade in the 20th century. And that's why the documentary series, The 50s.
Now, the first episode is called The Young, which is perhaps a fitting way to start. We see screaming Elvis fans. We hear about the dangers of going steady and worries about delinquents and teen gangs. How much of the 50s is really a story of young people and this newfound ability to shape Canadian society and culture?
It is, and that's why it's the first episode in our series. In the 50s, 1/3 of Canadians were school-aged or younger. When there is critical mass of young people, in Egypt, a president fell. So imagine, there was critical mass of teenagers in Canada in the 1950s, and they raised hell, and it worried people. The first private member's bill to clear the House of Commons after the Second World War was one to ban crime comics. Can you imagine? And that was important because they felt that crime comics were a bad influence on teenagers. Television was new. How do we regulate it? It's going to be a terrible influence on all of these young people. There's a lot of examples that tell us that people, lawmakers in particular, were freaking out about this critical mass of teenagers. Like what? Well, the University of Western Ontario banned leather jackets. School boards banned books. The works of Erskine Caldwell were being distributed by an Ottawa publisher. That netted him a $1,500 fine. The government of Alberta banned a Sidney Poitier film called The Blackboard Jungle because it was about teenagers raising hell. A terrible example. You know, imagine today if the majority, or a third of Canadians were 15 years old. How different would this country look? How different would it be? What would the dialogue be? Today, we know that a third of the country is over 40, and so maybe that explains a lot. You know, but my point is that there was a lot brewing beneath the surface, and people like to think, and maybe this is the influence of the baby boomers later on as they matured, people like to think that it was the 60s and the campus protest movement that gave rise to modern Canada. But the truth is that the seeds of that rebellion were sown in the 50s. And that is why the first episode is all about the young.
We hear from a lot of well-known names in the series, including a former prime minister. We also hear from Canadians who went about the business of buying their first home, going to their first rock concert, even fighting off polio. What were some of the best stories that you found as you dug deep into the 50s?
Well, you know, as important as the research are the stories of people who can put it all into context, as you say. And documentaries, I think anyway, are supposed to be about these stories that are never told. They're not supposed to be a recitation of dates or events, and they're not supposed to plow familiar ground of things you've already heard about. They're supposed to be about those little stories, those little yarns, and the big secrets that were never told. So like what? You mentioned we interviewed former Prime Minister Paul Martin, a schoolboy in the Cold War era, who confessed that he used to go by the Soviet embassy in Ottawa and huck stones every day on his way home from school until the police caught him and came to the house. There's the story of the little boy who had polio, the scourge of the decade, by the way, that gave rise to the healthcare system. The little boy who was picked to be an Easter Seals Timmy to represent all disabled children in Canada in that charitable fundraising effort. And my favorite story about the cabinet minister who was a spy, former fisheries minister, James Sinclair, under the Louis Saint Laurent administration, and father of Margaret Trudeau, by the way, future wife of a prime minister, was the first cabinet officer in the Western world to travel to Soviet Russia. And he took pictures.
Let's talk about James Sinclair for a moment, because it's a really interesting story. This was a secret for many years. How were you able to tell his story?
Well, you know, I mentioned before that we culled a lot of anecdotes out of the pages of the newspaper, things that are forgotten, that were much talked about then but forgotten today. And there was a story about Sinclair while he was on that trip to Russia, where he was feted and taken from coast to coast by the Soviets because he had a great pal in the Russian fisheries minister. When he went, because he was the first, you know, it was an important trip, but there was an accident. And the papers were full of the stories about how Sinclair fell in a shipping yard and broke his leg. So we spoke to Margaret Trudeau to ask her what she remembered about her father's homecoming and what had happened when he was in Russia, details that were not quite fleshed out in the newspapers of the day. And she said that it was all about spying, that Foreign Affairs had given James Sinclair a camera and asked him to take pictures when he was in Kamchatka, the port, of fishing vessels that the Americans thought might be being equipped with tanks lowered into them. And when he was there with this camera, on a scaffolding one day, he rose to take a picture saying, "Isn't this a beautiful view?" And the scaffolding tipped because the Russians lunged at him to stop the camera, and they all fell, 21 feet. That's 7 meters. Sinclair was more badly hurt than the newspapers suggested. He broke his back, and a Russian who lunged at him broke his fall and was killed. This story is in his memoirs, his unpublished memoirs, which we have, and we use to tell the story of James Sinclair's minor brush with espionage.
Well, finally, Holly, let's talk a bit about this process of putting together this series of shows. How much a kick did you get from going through all of the photos and films and memoirs that brought the 50s back to life on screen?
Sometimes I think it's more of a kick for viewers to watch. I hope it is, anyway, because the work is massive. It's 18 months of sifting through archives, separating the wheat from the chaff, reading all the newspapers, all the books, all the accounts, finding people, interviewing them, asking for interviews. But we have amassed miles of first-rate film, and not only from Library and Archives Canada, but research from UCLA Film Library in California, as well as the National Records Administration in Washington, which is the U.S. National Film Archives. There's miles of film about Canada there in the form of newsreels that you can't get here, that is priceless and has not been seen in 60 years. And you know, when you watch these films, it's really a thrill, and I've seen them dozens of times, but I can't believe I'm watching stories about Canadians. For instance, there was film of Calgary orchestrating the largest mass evacuation of citizens in NATO history in an air raid drill. Where have you seen that before? You haven't. And when you watch this stuff and you realize it's about us, you ask, why aren't these stories told? You know, we don't see stories about ourselves from long ago. We see stories about Americans, and we think that it's about us. So when you watch this, it's a thrill, because it's like watching ghosts, the people who came before us. And it was an important decade, and it's it's wonderful to see the people who walked our land and created all these programs and had these experiences.
Well, everyone else will get their chance to see this on March 13th. That's when the 50s premieres on CPAC. We have more information on the series at www.cpac.ca. Holly Doan, thanks so much again for joining us.
My pleasure.